This is Metro Week. Our top story, the proposed property tax increase for everyone in Pima County. We dissect the county budget with Supervisor Sharon Bronson.
I think a property tax hike of some magnitude is inevitable.
And we review the week's news with our Journalist Roundtable.
Hello, I'm Andrea Kelly. The Pima County Board of Supervisors will vote Tuesday on a budget for the next fiscal year. Here are some details. The Pima County property tax rate is going up by 12%. The increase is to make up for slack revenue years during the recession.
We're at the point of where we've exhausted now our reserves, and we either have to drastically cut services or increase rates, and I've recommended to the board that we increase the rates.
The increase will amount to about another $60 a year for a homeowner with a house valued at $150,000.
The largest single increase in our budget has been allocated to the sheriff, and so I indicated to the sheriff what happens if he doesn't get his $8 million plus that he's asking for. And he really talks about decreasing service, cutting patrol officers, cutting law enforcement, taking deputies out of schools. Those are the kind of cuts that he'd have to make if, in fact, we weren't going to raise taxes and just live with what we have today.
Primary property taxes pay for regular county services, including the Sheriff's Department. That's what Huckleberry is asking the supervisors to increase. In the last 10 years, the tax rate went up when property values went down. That meant the county brought in more revenue. The budget still went down, but slower than it would have if property taxes had not gone up.
Our taxes are way higher in Pima County than they are in other counties. And it's because of careless spending. Spending that is unnecessary, and some that's like the hospital here where it's just flat out wrong. There's no way on earth you can justify it.
Cromco is upset the county will give $15 million to the University of Arizona Medical Center South Campus. The county no longer owns the hospital, so Cromco says it's not taxpayers' responsibility.
Now they want to give him more money to the University of Arizona to run this hospital. University of Arizona, we all like them, but in fact they have plenty of money. And there's no reason on earth the taxpayers of Pima County should be giving them anything. You don't see Maricopa County taxpayers doing that.
What everybody forgets is that in the lease agreement with the university physicians, now the University Health Network, it's got a clause that says that if we don't make any contribution, typically the $15 million, they can terminate services and close the hospital. And so the consequence of not making that transfer is that, frankly, the hospital would more likely close, and all of the medical services that it provides today to the south side would cease.
Pima County Supervisor Sharon Bronson, a Democrat, is here now to talk about the proposed budget. Before we get started, we asked Republican Supervisors Allie Miller and Ray Carroll to join us. They were unavailable. Supervisor Bronson, you're going to be taking a vote on this budget on Tuesday. How are you thinking of voting?
Well, I think I'll probably be supportive of it, maybe with some caveats. It's a big budget, but it's still less than we were collecting in the 2009-2010 budget. But there's a generous amount for justice and law enforcement. 62% of the packages, the additional packages, relate to justice and law enforcement. So we need to look at that kind of more closely, I think. But in all, I think a property tax hike of some magnitude is inevitable. Again, let's look back to 2009, 2010. The average on a inflation-adjusted scenario, the average per capita burden to homeowners in this community was $465. If we are to take this budget as recommended by the county administrator, the tax burden is reduced almost 10% to $427. So we simply are not collecting as much money as we did at a lower tax rate in 2009-10, and we still have to provide the same services.
Just to put all of this in context, so you're saying that the recommended 12% property tax rate increase will actually result in about 10% less money because of housing values going down in between those times.
Housing values and a few other items, but largely, yes, the real estate, the decline in the assessed valuation of not only homes, but real estate generally in this community.
Okay, let's touch on a topic we just heard from John Kromko, who said that the spending on the University of Arizona Medical Center South Campus at $15 million a year is too much and that should be cut. Why not cut that spending?
If we cut that spending and we take over operations of the hospital, frankly, when we were doing it, we were spending $40 million. $15 million is considerably less. I suppose an option is to close it, although I'm not sure we actually statutorily can. But then we have a $200 million asset sitting empty. We have a major impact on the economy in that those jobs will not be available. So I think that the $15 million is an excellent investment, and the reality is it brings in to this economy, not to Pima County, but to the economy in general, at least twice that amount. So I think it's a very rational decision.
Do we see any other counties funding a hospital that the county does not run?
We don't. The Maricopa County has a public hospital. The Board of Supervisors, the county used to run it. They, a number of years ago, formed a special taxing district to do that. So instead of it being under the purview of the Board of Supervisors, it is now its own special taxing district.
So taxpayers are still
Taxpayers are picking up the tab.
Okay.
That's correct.
Let's talk about your priorities in the budget. You mentioned a few tweaks you'd like to make. What are the priorities you look at when you look at your decision on the budget?
Well, I think, I've always been focused on economic development and what is the best way that we can accomplish that. Obviously, I think one of the things the county can do when it comes to economic development is deal with some of our infrastructure issues. We've got crumbling roads. In the past, those roads have been funded by highway user revenue funds. Those funds have been decreasing, and in the last several years, the legislature has swept those funds to balance the state budget. So we have been forced to take money from the general fund rather than the revenue source was intended, and try to deal with some of the pavement preservation issues. Certainly that's a priority for me. There's money in this budget to do that. It's only $5 million. The problem is a $300 million problem, so we need to be talking about not only with this budget, but in general, is how do we deal with our crumbling infrastructure, not only locally or across Pima County, but in this state, and it should be a national conversation as well.
How else is the county directly funding economic development or influencing economic development with its budget choices?
I think that we certainly invest in community development, which has economic development impact, but we also provide some money to TRIO, Tucson Regional Economic Opportunities. They are in the business of attraction and expansion and retention, and if we bring those good high-paying jobs into this community, or either through expansion or attraction, our economy will improve, and as a result, your taxes will go down.
The county doesn't rely as heavily on sales taxes as, say, the city does, so how does that economic development help the county budget?
Well, actually, you bring up a good point. One of the reasons our property taxes are high is because we're the only county without a sales tax. Were we to have a sales tax, we could reduce the property tax burden concomitantly. So we actually have just that one income stream that we have control of, and that is property taxes. And it's unfortunate that we are the only county in Arizona to not to have sales tax. Other counties have at least 2 forms of sales tax, and we have none. So that says something about why our property taxes are higher than, say, Maricopa County.
The Pima County Hispanic, or the Pima Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, is opposing the proposed property tax increase that you guys will consider on Tuesday, saying that will sort of hurt the businesses that are trying to recover from the recession. Can you respond to that?
Well, I think the businesses will be hurt more if we don't do pavement preservation, if we actually have to start cutting services like justice and law enforcement, sheriff's deputies on the street. And the reality is we have tightened our belt since 2007. We've reduced our employees by 1,200. And the only option to not increasing taxes is to start cutting in justice and law enforcement, in parks, closing libraries. And again, I think that has serious economic development consequences and will impede the economic recovery.
We've got about a minute and a half left, and I want to ask you about another budget priority. We've heard in years past from the Republicans on the Pima County Board of Supervisors that they're opposed to the amount of debt that the county has, or proposals to potentially have more debt to fund projects. Why is the Pima County, using debt to fund capital improvements?
Well, the short answer is we don't have Palo Verde nuclear power plant in our backyard like Maricopa County. We simply don't have the assessed valuation to provide the kind of infrastructure without taking on some form of debt. We don't have a sales tax. And we don't have high assessed valuation, and yet we need to provide that infrastructure. So I don't know how else you fund it, but we've been doing it very wisely in that typically the length of time those bonds are out are between 10 and 12 years, unlike some municipalities which draw them out to 30 years and lots of interest involved. So I think, again, we behaved responsibly, but we simply don't have the deep pockets that Maricopa County does to pay as you go, and we need to build that infrastructure.
Thanks so much for coming in. Stay with us for our Journalist Roundtable.
An influx of unaccompanied children at the border creates a crisis. What now for thousands of children in Nogales and other detention centers? Later on Arizona Week.
Here to discuss the top news of the week are Arizona Public Media's Zach Ziegler, Dylan Smith of TucsonSentinel.com, and Thelma Grimes of the publication group Tucson Local Media. Dylan, let's start with the county budget. We've been hearing this back and forth about whether we should be cutting spending or raising taxes. Is it really as simple as that?
Not really. I mean, it's always easy to try and reduce political questions to an either or, but it really comes down to what would you cut? What do you not want the county to do anymore? And the county has already cut fairly significantly, especially from the height of the housing bubble, as housing valuations and real estate values have gone down. The county budget has shrunk significantly. They've laid off 1,200 people, and there's not a whole lot more there's a lot of support to cut. You know, we don't see the same sort of controversy over the county budget as we see with the city budget, where people get riled up about an increase in business taxes or, Suntran rates, the streetcar, things like that.
In your reporting or in your coverage, have you had any indication of why that is, why we just don't hear as much from the public about the county budget proposals?
The county does a whole lot of more fundamental things. They do put some money into some, social services and outside agencies and things like that. But a lot of what it does is really the fundamental work of government, taking care of roads. Some people would question whether that includes having the hospital, although it's kind of an open question as to whether the county is required to have access to medical services in that way. And, especially with law enforcement and roads, that's the biggest chunks of the county budget. And
we are seeing that law enforcement budget increasing if you also include the justice system, which are kind of some of the things that the county is mandated to do by the state. You can't control if there's higher prosecutions, things like that.
Defense attorneys for people who are indigent. There's also costs with the jail, and a whole big ball of wax. And it's really, I don't see too many people pointing to very specific things that the county shouldn't do. There are people that say we shouldn't raise taxes. The Tucson Hispanic Chamber of Commerce came out against this property tax increase.
Some of that also with a lack of public interest, maybe because there's less public outreach from the county. I know District 1 Supervisor Allie Miller, she wanted more study sessions, and that was turned down by the other board members. Is some of that part of the problem?
That might be a little bit of it, that there's just not quite as much opportunity for people to get in front of the supervisors. Well, of course, they can show up at any supervisor's meeting and have their say, but it doesn't quite work in the same way as the city budget does, where I think there is a lot of support on the city council for having a lot of public hearings, because then they can show that, yes, people do support these programs. It kind of works in a little bit of a different way.
Thelma, on that political note, I mean, we see that the northwest side of town, which is one of the publications you edit, the Northwest Explorer, that side of town tends to be more conservative. That's where Allie Miller represents. Is there a way to kind of incorporate that Republican perspective and moderate the Democratic proposals in this budget? Are we seeing any of that?
I think a lot of with Allie Miller, her complaints are around spending. She wants less spending, less on the U of A Medical Center, 15 million there. She wants less on public relations. She says that there's wasteful spending and that the county can do better.
Okay. And another big news story of the week, actually this has been kind of 2 weeks we've been talking about this story about unaccompanied minors crossing the border in Texas. There's not enough room in the shelters for them, and some of them are being sent to Nogales. Dylan, we heard a little bit about how that could impact Tucson this week with a potential new shelter opening. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, there's a private firm that's wants to have a contract with the government to run a shelter for these kids who are being sent to Arizona. And there was a little bit of a roadblock with them being able to meet city codes to get this opened, but the city is giving them temporary variance for up to 1 year so they can get this facility opened up without going through the public hearings that would be required for a permanent facility. If they're going to keep it open on a permanent basis, they'll have to eventually do that process.
When I interviewed County Administrator Chuck Huckleberry, he said there'd also been an inquiry into whether there could be a shelter in the county, but no permit has been pulled, so it looks like the city might be the place where that could locate.
Have they said how many kids they're expecting to bring into the Tucson area?
I think in this shelter, I believe it's going to be about 250 beds. And
I know they said that all kids will be deported later on. How long are these kids staying here? Until everything goes through.
The process is really kind of complex because legally these children are entitled to a hearing within 72 hours. But there's really no place to send them. For the children who are unaccompanied, undocumented, we don't know where they came from, who they are, where their parents are, where their family is. And most of these children are from Central America, so it's not as simple as it is with illegal immigrants from Mexico of just busing them, say, to Nogales and dropping them off. You can't put them to a third country. We can't just send them back to Mexico. They didn't come from Mexico.
We've also heard that some nonprofit groups in Tucson are trying to collect items to get to the children in the shelters. Are they having success with this?
I've heard from federal authorities that they really don't want a whole lot of stuff. They don't have the logistical ability to deal with an influx of random items. I guess you heard that they want some clothing, that they need to get these kids some changes of clothes. But
yeah, clothing but no hygiene items is one thing that they were talking about for the Nogales shelter, but I haven't heard anything yet about what Tucson would need or how they would even handle it.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure about the timeline for getting the facility here open. They need to get into that building and do the work to get it up to code to actually bring people in there.
So with all of that said, what's next in either processing, dealing with these kids, or what are we going to see next in Tucson?
Here specifically in Tucson, it's not so much going to be about what happens in Tucson. Certainly in southern Arizona, the federal authorities, as long as there's this enormous wave of kids who are mostly coming to Texas, they just don't have the ability to deal with them all there, and so they're basically farming them out to other places, including here, because and Nogales especially, because it's another place to get them. You can't just leave them out.
On another immigration story, we're hearing the Obama administration announced this week, or the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that a man who was seeking sanctuary in a Tucson church has been given a 1-year reprieve. He will not be deported for that year. We saw in the 1980s that similar cases in Tucson spurred a nationwide sanctuary movement. Is this going to be a model for other people?
This case is a little bit different than the 1980s sanctuary movement. In a lot of those cases, it was about hiding people and keeping them from coming to the notice of federal authorities. This was somebody who got pulled over for a smoking tailpipe and didn't have any documents proving that he could be here, and was then put into the legal system and given a deportation order. And he didn't want to leave, so he sought refuge at Southside Presbyterian. And there's a law that was passed last year codifying a policy that's been in place for a number of years saying that immigration agents should be very cautious about going into churches and schools and places that they think are sensitive.
So it doesn't look like this is set up to be kind of an example case so far.
You know, it might turn into a different sort of example with people who have deportation orders, you know, trying to find places where they won't get picked up.
Okay. Move on to some of the business stories of the week. Zach, one of the stories you covered this week was a proposed huge development in Sierra Vista that had permits to actually start some of the work it needed to develop, and then that got overturned in court this week. What happened there?
Yeah, it's Tribute down in Sierra Vista, being built by a company called Castle & Cook. It's actually a very impressive community, 7,000 homes. It's basically the biggest chunk of developed land, or developable land in Sierra Vista is this. And they were building these homes to a water sense standard, the EPA standard for water efficiency. Okay. But the issue then became, well, is that even enough? Because they have to worry about the San Pedro River. This sits on the west side, southwest side of Sierra Vista, right getting into the area where you'd be tapping into aquifers that feed the San Pedro. So are you going to deplete it to the point where it really can't recover? Are you going to be draining groundwater? And a big thing that's actually coming out of this is, for the longest time, Arizona has not really seen a link in legal terms between groundwater and surface water. They treated the two as separate. Well, I actually just spoke to a hydrologist with USGS today who said that might change as a result of this case.
And this all dates back to the requirement that any new development in Arizona needs to assure that it has enough water for 100 years of however many residents it's adding. So initially that was assured, and now that got turned over in court.
Yeah, there is some talk that that might not be the case because in Sierra Vista, it's such a unique situation. Yes, there's plenty of water there, but the San Pedro becomes the issue. It's going to become, are they going to drain from the San Pedro? Are they going to cause it to lose base flow? That could happen if you build these houses.
Is this going to become a city of Sierra Vista problem ultimately, or is this just an isolated problem for one developer in one area?
Well, it's kind of hard to say. I mean, 7,000 houses, 2,000 acres, you're talking about a huge, huge development. Who knows how they would feel if someone, got their hands on 10 acres and wanted to build 20 houses. That might not be as much of an issue, but it's really hard to say. Sierra Vista has really had issues with water in the past. You just have to look at what they're doing in Fort Huachuca to really see that they are cutting down on water as much as possible in that area, because if they don't, they might lose some of the operations at the military base.
Will this kind of force them to look at that 100-year water assurance policies? I mean, and to some degree, you've got the wet water, but you've got paper water, and you've got CAP water, and you've got all this stuff that affects it in statewide issues. Is that going to start being maybe taking another look at it?
They might have to. It's one of those things. They're really having to rewrite every policy in the city on water right now just to make sure that they can keep the San Pedro flowing, to basically keep it so that they don't have any issues from the federal government moving people out of Fort Huachuca, because Fort Huachuca represents, I believe, about 60% of the jobs in that community.
So that's housing development. We'll switch to job development. Thelma, Inside Tucson Business this week is looking at TRIO, the Tucson Regional Economic Opportunities Organization, how it plans to recruit people, add jobs in the next 5 years. What does that blueprint entail?
We did. We took a look at the blueprint that TRIO laid out last month. They laid out this 5-year plan that they started in 2007, but the recession kind of stopped a lot of those goals. So then they decided we're going to revamp it. And in that revamp, they said we're going to create 40,000 jobs in 5 years by looking at some key areas such as healthcare, talent, the business community, infrastructure, and all of that. So that amounts to about 2% growth a year with 8,000 jobs. The problem with that is they're already at a deficit. According to TRIO, there's 2,900 jobs in Tucson that are skilled positions that still remain unfilled.
So does that speak to how realistic this plan is?
I think that does speak a lot to it, because in 2009 there was 2,200 jobs unfilled. Now we have even more than that. So I think it's going to be tough to meet that 40,000 goal, especially when the main goal of the blueprint is everybody has to start working together. Schools, partnerships with regional communities, that all has to start coming together. Infrastructure, roads, all of that is equally important.
Is this a real plan, or is it a shiny marketing project?
And I think that's part of it. You got to remember TRIO's funded by all of the taxpayers, really. You've got Oro Valley involved, Marana involved, Sarita involved. You have City of Tucson, Pima County. They're all involved. So they have to come up with a plan. But the thing we look at is, how do you achieve that plan, especially when you're starting at that deficit? So I would say right now it's going to be interesting to see what they do going forward.
With TRIO and some of its predecessors like GTEC and some of the other groups, we haven't really seen these big promises pay off.
Absolutely, and I think that's going to be a focus going forward. They were able to say the 2007 plan didn't work because of the recession, and they're absolutely right. So going forward, if no recession hits, how will this 5-year plan pan out, and what do they do to make it happen?
One of the things we've been hearing from both municipal groups, from business groups, Zach, is that cross-border trade across the U.S. and Mexico border, is really crucial to kicking off the economic development in southern Arizona. Why is that so important?
It's important because it is a big economic driver. I mean, this is the big entry point for produce. About 4 billion pounds of produce have come through Nogales in the last year. That's quite a bit of money coming across. If you look at it, there's in the neighborhood of 16,000 trucks coming across. 12,000 of those are produce per day. And with the Mariposa Port of Entry getting ready to expand, that could only go even further to moving more trucks across the border. You need to figure out a way you can kind of capitalize on what you've got going, and one thing Tucson has going is location. It's a great hub for things heading east and west after they come up from the south.
I think that figure was 1,600 trucks?
1,600 trucks per day coming through. Yeah, sorry.
So how is this hindering development?
Well, one thing that you always have to look at as far as any hindrances is the roads heading to either side. ADOT just today said one of our big future goals is to revamp State Route 189, which connects Mariposa to I-19. And then you can look on the other side of the border. While there have been plans to revamp that road, nothing is moving forward quite yet. The other thing you have to think about is the number of people working at those stations. It's great if you have the space to inspect 30 trucks at a time, but you really need the necessary number of people. It doesn't help you if only 16 of those are open.
All right, we've got just a couple minutes left, so I want to pivot to politics. Dylan, this week in the Congressional District 3 race, we saw, that's the district that runs from Tucson all the way over to Yuma, the California state line. We saw a new Republican come into the race. We already had Gabriela Saucedo Mercer, who filed to run, and Mike Pollock, who's run for a couple city offices, joined that race. We also saw Libertarian Miguel Olivas drop out of that race. So now we have
Republican turned Democrat turned Republican turned Libertarian.
Correct,
like
yes.
Olivas.
But so the stage is set right now. We've got Raul Grijalva, who would be seeking his 7th term, and 2 Republicans running for the nomination and then to compete against him. Do Republicans have a chance in this district?
You know, there are many, many, many things I would bet on before I would bet on a Republican getting that seat. It's, you have Mike Pollock running as a write-in, and he's going to need a significant number of votes to get over that hump and get on the ballot in November. He would have to beat Gabby Mercer, who has had, you couldn't have more anemic fundraising efforts thus far. She had one report where she was actually in the hole in her campaign. Last time around, I can't remember exactly what the point spread was between Mercer and Grijalva, but it was enormous.
It's a simple question of voter registration.
Yeah, it's a Democratic district.
And then we also saw some challenges in Legislative District 9, Republican Ethan Orr has seen some challenge from the Democratic Party trying to get him off the ballot in a Democratic legislative district. Really quick, what's going on there?
Well, you have 3 candidates running for 2 seats, an incumbent Democrat or who's an incumbent Republican and another Democrat. And the Democrats would like an easy victory in November, and if they can get him booted off the ballot, they claim that almost half of the nominating signatures that he filed are somehow invalid.
Okay, great. Well, we'll keep following that one as it goes. Thanks you all for joining us this week. That's our program. Next on Arizona Week, Christopher Conover interviews a Border Patrol agent who visited with some of the 1,000 Central American children in a shelter in Nogales.